Viewers and listeners of the Modern Monarchist channel, I'm very happy to present to you the beginning of several interviews and conversations with the author of a book called Boomers' Families: How a Generation Became a Force for Destruction. Her name is Margaret Clare Devlin, and what she has to say here will shake you, it will move you, and it will certainly interest you when it comes to a very important decade and the decades that followed it. The 60s, the 70s, the 80s, etc. Now, while the conversations that will take place in the next few sessions will be far more detailed and focused, zoomed in on certain issues of a particular flavor, this first of many is merely to dip your toes in. It's an introduction to the book, what it's about, the life that the author lived, the issues that confronted her and her family, and of course, the results of the revolution which shook a generation, which shaped modern America. So I am very happy to present to you right now Margaret Clare Devlin. Margaret, when it came to developing your ideas for the book, that's a whole different, conversation and question. Certainly that's been going your whole life. But what really was the catalyst, you could say, or what was the storm that brought it out, that brought these words out of you, and who were the people involved in helping you could say, get this book about, in, first of all, at least making you feel like you could publish it. If that's too broad of a question, perhaps I could narrow it for you, but.
Okay, well, in the 1990s, I was asked to write an essay for a book that was including essays from women who had been involved in the feminist movement and had decided to not only not continue to follow the feminist movement, but to return to the Catholic Church. That was the theme of the book. And I wrote that essay, and it was published in a book by a major Catholic publisher. And E. Michael Jones read the essay. Now, I had written a few book reviews on his books, so that's how I knew him. And he had read the essay, and he told me that I should enlarge it and write a book about and make it into a book. So basically, the essay, as I said, was about women who had left the Catholic Church, had become involved in the feminist movement, and then had decided to come back. And this was in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. So it took me a few years to get to the point of writing the book. In fact, it took me more than a few years. And by that time, I had married and I had become a mother. So I had some other influences other than what I had originally written in the essay. But going back to E. Michael Jones, I had read, before I wrote the essay, I had read Libido Dominandi, and I had read Degenerate Moderns, and I had read Cardinal Kroll and the Cultural Revolution. And they formed a guiding theme in the essay, which is, I'm sure, why Mike thought it would be good for me to enlarge it into a book, because it really confirmed the ideas that he had brought out in those books. And the main ideas that I took from his book were his explanations of social engineering and the effect it had on the baby boomer generation, and the fact that the baby boomer generation was, as he says, guinea pigs, and that every generation after our generation are guinea pigs. That we didn't just create ourselves as revolutionaries. We were created by social engineering. And the second thought was very powerful in his book, Degenerate Moderns, it's kind of a philosophical idea. But it's basically that when people are faced with ideas that go against the moral law, a person either has two choices, one of two choices. Either he can conform his desires to the truth, to the moral law, or he can conform truth to his desires. That idea really hit me after I had lived through the sexual revolution, and I had seen how much that shaped the sexual revolution. You know, that we were brought up as Catholics, but when we were faced with a moral decision, we had learned how to shape the truth to fit our desires. And we learned it from our culture. We learned it from the social engineering that was exacerbated our own natural paganism and our own natural lusts. So those were the two main ideas that I took from E. Michael Jones. But when I got married and had children, then I began to read books on child rearing, and they helped me to understand what happened to our generation. And that became another major subject in my book. And then another, I would say, a final, one of the major subjects is a retreat that I made that was given by a priest by the name of Father John Hugo in Pittsburgh. And he had a great influence on Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker, but he was still giving silent retreats. And I made that retreat, and it brought me back to my Christian faith and to the church. And that retreat and the influence it had on me forms another big part of the book. So those were some of the influences I had. There were many other that I did a lot of research, and I refer to in the book. I have a bibliography in the back of the book with all the names of the people that I used in my research.
That's right, and it was great to hear that explanation of how those things influenced you, because things are never produced in a vacuum. They're never born really from a vacuum. And when I read the book, and just to give a little bit of a background on how big the book is, this is a very well documented. It's a well researched. It's quite a big book. It's over 700 pages in that main edition there. And then in the title of the book, if we haven't brought it up already, it's called Boomers' Families: How a Generation Became a Force for Destruction. And when I was reading the book, that's what I tied together too. What a lot of young people, my age, I think, millennials or Gen Z, they think that just one day when the earth was green and, the country was still great, the boomers just one day woke up and decided to burn it all down in a bunch of
Yes.
revelry with a big, Dionysian party.
Yes. Right.
And it didn't happen that way. And when I was reading this book, it fully dawned on me that, yes, there was just like most events in history, there's a subtle building up, and there's this sort of cranking of the ratchet strap, and things get a little more and more easily controlled by what I read and what I liked in your book, what you called apparatchiks, by the apparatchiks of this social engineering system. And that's essentially what I think this book has done so well for so many people, and what we want to talk about more too is that what you experienced in your life living through the sexual revolution, seeing the denigration, the destruction of a lot of Christian Catholic culture, seeing how your cohort was manipulated, and then seeing all that from how you lived it and then how you escaped it, and then how it is now. There's a lot of people that think that that was the golden era, the 60s and the 70s. If we could only return to the 60s and 70s. So
Yes.
which I disagree with, but you can't really explain that to people because there are so many boomers that are caught up in the mythos of their own youth.
Right. Right.
And I wanted to touch on one thing there.
Could I say one thing, Joe?
Yes.
First of all, I'm very glad you actually gave the title of the book.
Of course, yes.
And secondly, you talk about how your generation and some of the older generations in yours, the 13th generation and some of the others, they do blame the boomers, for just doing it. I mean, they decided they were going to do it and they did it. They just, set the culture on fire. But it's not just the younger generations. The older generations did too. And they're the ones who gave birth to us and raised us. And they said, look at these people, look what they're doing, And so I remember talking to a man that was probably from the silent generation, and he was just talking about the contempt he had for the hippies. And I just pointed out to him, we just didn't do it. We had a lot of influence from your generation and our parents' generation. And he just really didn't like to hear that. There is a sense that, like I said, unless you understand social engineering, which E. Michael Jones explains so well in his books, you really will not understand what happened in the sexual revolution. So,
yeah,
go on.
That's wonderful. I mean, what you said there and explaining it, because I was thinking about how the older generation certainly manhandled, manipulated your generation into becoming, incendiary, revolutionaries, or at least, as that man said in a derogative way, hippies, the hippies, the peace cult or whatever, the flower power people. I was thinking a lot of Catholics don't understand this, and I think that's a big aspect of it is parenting and child rearing. I know in your book you said that manipulation, it begins with child rearing and child rearing philosophy. Would that be a place you'd like to touch on further in this book? Maybe later or now?
Well, I can talk about it now. I would say at least 50% of the book, in one way or another, is given to research and childbirth. And well, I should explain how the book is set up. So the book is set up so that it's divided into every chapter, or sometimes a whole chapter is divided into the ideas and the story. So I actually have those in the subheadings, the ideas and the story. The story is the story of my life and my family's life. And my family is extreme. So they are a very good subject for the book. They're kind of Dickensian in their extremity. And there were 5 children, and we were wild and kind of like the Kennedys, in their wildness, and of that same generation. And so, and then there were my friends. And so, and they were, some of them were wild, but I develop the ideas, I document the ideas by telling the story of my life, which is why it's written under a pseudonym. So the idea of child rearing is in the first part of the book. I have several chapters based on my research into it, which is almost entirely the ideas about child rearing and the Catholic ideas versus the secular kind of Freudian ideas, that modern psychology ideas, and what effect they have on children. And then those ideas are developed by talking about my grandparents' upbringing, my parents' upbringing, and then my generation's upbringing, mostly my generation's upbringing. And so that's how the story the story documents the ideas. And as you said, it's an idea that, for instance, E. Michael Jones did review my book in Culture Wars, but he never mentioned the child rearing aspect.
I wonder why.
I don't know if that maybe didn't interest him, but that's a huge part of the book. It just basically it explains how social engineering creates neurotics, and how the Catholic Christian teaching works to raise or rear emotionally mature adults, whereas liberalism, which is social engineering, creates neurotics. So there's a lot about the neurosis that we have in our society today, and that we're seeing, so flagrantly now. So child rearing is a big part of it.
Yeah, and one thing I think would be great for people to hear to flesh this out is that, again, going back to the myth of that there were these, perhaps stoic, fathers and, submissive mothers in the, the GI generation. And then suddenly, bam, Pandora's box was opened. Then there was revolution. A lot of people, they don't want to investigate a lot of the nitty gritty, awful stuff that was going on during the 40s and 50s and 60s, which led to the boomers revolting. And that's what I found very interesting about your book, is that the GI generation and other generations, before them and between, they had issues. They certainly had issues, in America especially, where there was this, this glut of materialism and commercialism, and a good idea that if you're a Catholic, you need to either remove yourself from society, or if you want to succeed in society, you kind of have to mute your Catholicism. You have to mute it. You have to wrap it in a way that is more acceptable to broader society. Was that happening at that time? Did you notice quite a bit of that, sort of the muting, the silencing of overt Catholic culture amongst Catholics? Did that happen in your family?
Yes. I mean, I didn't notice it, because this is the thing about social engineering and secularism. And as I said, as I explained the baby boomers, this is how we grew up. We didn't notice it because it was just there. But no, my parents, especially my mother's side of the family, yes, you did just want to assimilate into the culture. And it was in the 60s, it was very prevalent. We all went to public schools, and we just became like everyone else. And even like I went to public schools, but my older siblings went to Catholic schools, and the same thing happened to them. It was just the way we were raised. It was just what was happening in society. And I can't blame my parents' generation, because they too had been socially engineered. And I do spend a little bit time at the beginning of the book, even going back to my grandparents' generation. One of the other books that was a very great influence when I wrote and really helped me to understand was a book the book called Generations. Let me get the authors here.
No worries.
William Strauss and Neil Howe. And apparently they've written other books that are very, a lot of your generation are referring to their work. But this was one of their first ones, and it was called Generations, The History of America's Future, 1584 to 2069. And by reading that about my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation, I understood a lot more about where we came from. So that is definitely part of the book. And yes, they were under great pressure to assimilate into the American culture. Catholics were, or they couldn't get jobs. They couldn't. My father had a very hard time getting his PhD because he was at a Protestant university. They were definitely, there was a lot of prejudice against Catholics in this country. And, you know, my aunt would send out applications to teaching jobs, and she would get back, we don't hire Catholics. You know, so there was a lot of pressure to assimilate, and you had to have a lot of strength not to do it. And by the time my generation came along, you know, we were definitely didn't even have the idea not to be like everyone else. It just wasn't there.
Do you think
for
that
a lot of us?
Excuse me. Do you think that was because of like the spirit of conformity that existed in the early 20th century, where everyone was meant to be in this you know, very synchronized community of group thought, with the GI generation? Would you say that was kind of their
Yes, that's what Strauss and Hall talked about, the GI generation as a great conforming generation. And a lot of it was education. It was all, you know, public education. Like, for instance, my father, he went to a prep school run by monks and priests, and he was definitely far less conformist to the society than my mother, who went to a public school. So education played a huge role. And then after education came television. And, you know, television played a huge role. And then everything exploded after World War II in my generation. You know, music, magazines, Time Life, you know, television, everything. Everything was geared towards creating a revolutionary generation.
Right. And it sounds like it's almost like you could draw a comparison to legalizing every single form of drug, and then maybe not even just stopping at legalizing it, but then celebrating it, and then maybe future on enforcing it in some circumstances. It sounds like that, but on a, you know, a spiritual level.
Right.
Because how are you supposed to handle that without having good, you know, parents that are, you know, astute to what's going on,
right,
up to snuff, up to speed.
Right. And they were taken by surprise too, the GI generation and the silent generation, you know, which is the generation after, that also raised some of the boomers. And, you know, you talk about just talking about drug, metaphorically or not, you know, now we find out that the CIA was involved in getting the drugs out there. I mean, every year we find out through some book or something that's been released about just how much was involved at the government level, the foundation level, the publishing level, the entertainment level, how many of them were involved with the social engineering and the CIA, you know. So it was quite a powerful war to face as those generations, the GI, the silent, and the boomers at that time.
It was a like a tidal wave, and
yes.
There's no boat that, you know, can survive the tidal wave, right? I mean,
right.
Who knows where the waves carry you? And
it's only because, in retrospect, people like E. Michael Jones, you know, began to research this, and he himself talks about how he was part of it and then, you know, he started, because he's a great and brilliant researcher. he was able to find out things one book at a time, one book at a time. You didn't know what was happening. It was very few people that knew what was happening. And many of them were probably older Catholics that had read, like my father, or even older, that had read the old books that the Catholics wrote on liberalism, because it is about liberalism and the church's statements on liberalism. You have to go back to, the 1800s and the early 1900s, and the church warned against those things, but their voices were overwhelmed. Those voices. And then you had Vatican II.
That's the other big big
which
thing
is also a big part of the book. I mean, Vatican II completely undid those voices that were decrying liberalism. I mean,
right. The wolves were at the door, and the shepherds opened the door.
Exactly.
So
I can read one section from my book that's from the introduction, that because I spent some time to make sure my writing was clear, this might be a clear overview of what the book's about. If you would like me to read this short section.
Absolutely, yes, go ahead.
So I said, this book is about four big things. It is about the sexual revolution, which means it is a history of a certain time. It is about the ideas that fueled the sexual revolution, which means it is about both ideologies and philosophies. It is about a group of people, the baby boomers, born between 1943 and 1960, and their families, which means it is about psychology, and it is about Christianity, mostly Catholicism, which means it is about faith. The book includes both a narrative and an analysis. The narrative is about my family, my friends, and my own life. The analysis is about the ideas concerning social engineering, child rearing, neurosis, and the collapse of Christianity, among other things. Because the narrative gives the structure to the book of ideas, I don't claim to have written a scholarly research paper. To be precise, I write as a Christian, not a social scientist. I write an autobiography that also offers retrospective explanations based on both my experiences and my research. So that's the four big ideas and there are a lot of details, because as you said, it's a big book, 700 pages. I kept journals my entire life. So I have primary sources that I wrote at the time, which are very valuable in bringing back what actually happened. I also have an unusually large a large number of experiences, which is why I was asked to write the essay in the first place.
You've lived many lives.
Yes,
when people read the book, they'll see that.
When I first wrote the essay, it was about the time that Forrest Gump, that movie, was on. And Forrest Gump, he kept showing up in these like very important, significant historical events. Like, I can't remember what they were. I think one time he showed up with the president of the United
Nixon.
States.
Yeah, he showed up with Nixon or something.
Yeah. And I felt like, I never showed up with the president of the United States, but I feel like I was at very significant points in my generations.
Like seminal events.
Yes, seminal events in my generation's lifetime. And so I don't know why God led me on that path, but he did. And it gave me a lot to write about. So there are a lot of details about the experiences that my generation had, which I could kind of, if you want, I could talk about a few of them. I traveled to Afghanistan and India. I traveled to South America. I went out west. I lived in the mountains of Oregon as a hippie. I did And then my family, my older siblings, my sister was in Vietnam. My brothers were would have been draft dodgers. They weren't considered, for various reasons, they weren't considered good material for the Army.
Right.
Yeah, so there were many things in my life that exemplified my generation. And I have, like I said, I kept journals. So I have the primary sources for the way we talked, the way we wrote, the way we thought about things. I have letters from other members of my family. I have letters from my dad from World War II. So there's a lot of detail in the book. That's right. That's in the story part. And then the idea part, there's a lot of research about what happened, because I wanted to find out what happened to my family and to me. That's the real reason I wrote the book. I was on a quest. Like, what happened? How did we end up this way?
You were like
How
a
did my
detective.
family? Yeah. Yeah, my family in so many ways was a mess, and we shouldn't have been. But we ended up, pretty messed up. So I wanted to find out
Yes.
what
Those four things there, Margaret, sexual revolution, the ideas that were behind it, the baby boomers themselves, and Christianity. We could take those in really any direction. I mean, if you want to talk about the ideas first or the family, that's really up to you. But there's so much meat to discuss in this book. We could do this over several little audio conversations here.
Okay.
So it's really what's your yearning and burning part of this that you'd want to reach people first in this first tier video. Like which one is something that you want to discuss and make sure people get right about your life, or the ideas that affected your life, your generation, etc.
Okay, well, that's a very good question. Um, I I thought, if you don't think it's too staid and not very interesting, I thought I would read a little bit from the chapter that was called "How Did the Boomers Turn Out?"
Mm-hmm.
Just a few little excerpts from there that would kind of give the people a little bit of the idea of what I dealt with in the book. Would that be okay?
Oh, go for it. Yes, the stage is yours.
Okay. All right. Well, as I said, in the first part of the book, I start talking about my family. I start with the first chapter is a very detailed incident in my family where we were sitting at a Christmas dinner table, and it was about 1969. And my brothers had already been busted for pot and for dealing pot. And this is a Catholic family, Christmas is a big deal. We're sitting at the table and, a beautiful meal. And my brother, Rich, and of course all the names are changed, pulls out a pipe and says, "Let's smoke some marijuana." And my dad thought he was joking. And so he lights up the pipe, and my dad smoked pipes. And he began to, and I thought I think I was about 14, 15 at the time. And I thought, well, my parents know that we smoke pot because, my gosh, the smoke was drifting through the house all the time. So I thought, okay, this is going to be okay. And so he lights up the pipe and passes it around, and people are, smoking pot like they smoke pot, taking a big breath. And hands it to my dad after it goes around, and he inhales, and the look on his face was just pure shock. And he said, "You mean you have pot in here?" And so that's the first chapter. That sets the scene for just how huge the generation gap was already between the generations, and how much the boomers thought they could get away with the older generation at that point.
Yeah, it sounds like they're trying
So
to
I
play
go
for
from
fools,
there.
you know?
Pardon?
It's like they're trying to play them for fools, you know, the disconnect is so great.
Yes. And it just destroyed the Christmas dinner. My father was devastated. My mother, who was like, she was the GI generation that just went along with every change. You know, they were two very different people. And, you know, she just kind of was like, oh, you know, I guess we have to ride this. And anyway, it was a very bad scene, as we used to say. And so from that point on, I talk about my parents' generation and the whole Catholic assimilation, and then I talk about how the Catholic Church teaches that we should rear our children, but how the secular world at that time was teaching us to rear our children. And I go on, and then I talk about how the boomers were reared, you know, based on research into Spock and some other people. Mm-hmm. And then I come to this chapter where I said, you know, how did the boomers turn out? So here are some of the, and it's a long chapter, and I'll just read a few excerpts here. But
yes, as long as you like, it's you just do what you do what you need to do. It's all interesting for these new people here that are listening.
Okay. Well, the first thing I said, I stress that this is a summary of social character. Many boomers do not have all, and some may not have any of the following characteristics. I'm speaking generally. And that's important. I'm speaking about a generation, so I'm speaking generally. Yes. This is not all the boomers by any means. And, you know. But the first thing I said is boomers are socially engineered. We're socially engineered. And I said, starting with Spock's arson and fire truck variety of trial and error guidance, boomers have been the object of many experiments in social engineering. For instance, Strauss and Howe note that the medical profession experimented on boomers with such things as fluoridating water to protect teeth, and millions of circumcisions and tonsillectomies that would not now be performed. They claim that, quote, no generation of kids ever got more shots or had more operations, unquote, and, quote, pediatrics reached the height of physical aggression, unquote. This was from Generations. Boomers remember X-ray machines zapping their feet every time they went to buy shoes. This was considered entertainment. And these examples are just in the field of medicine. The number of books published during the boomers' lifetime that expose government and or corporations working together to seduce, coerce, intimidate, or manipulate the masses into doing certain actions, eating certain foods, thinking certain thoughts, and seeking certain things is a monument to the amount of social engineering they have endured. Most boomers knew very little about the social engineering, since social engineering by its very nature is secretive. It is only by reading books that they ever find out in what ways they have been conditioned, enticed, lied to, or otherwise deceived into doing what the elite wanted. And then I talk about some of those books, like The Underground History of American Education by John Taylor Gatto, that talks about education, The Untold Story of Milk, that talks about food, Libido Dominante, Sexual Liberation and Political Control by E. Michael Jones, that talks about how social engineers manipulated the sexual revolution, including drugs and other pathologies. So that's and I go on to talk a little bit more about the social engineering. That's one of the characteristics of boomers. The second one is boomers were not really reared to be Christians. Really, even in Christian homes, they were often reared to be hedonists and other kinds of pagans. Boomers from Christian homes often led secret lives. The absolutely correct altar boy at the beautiful traditional Latin Mass was already very well practiced in breaking the Ten Commandments whenever he could get away with it. So I again quote from Strauss and Howe, and it said, 30th first waivers, the oldest boomers, were also actively designing a new concept of religion. The boom heralded the new age with the manifesto of the person, asserting our sovereign right of self-discovery. So, you know, we lost Christianity a lot during that generation. But we weren't reared, and the churches and our society played a large role in the loss of that. It wasn't like we just grew up as Christians and then said, "Oh, we're done with it." You know, it again, we were social. That's why I started with social engineering.
Yes. If I may just ask real quickly here,
Yeah.
how would you describe it? Because there's quite a few people that say, we had generations and generations, hundreds of years of from father to son, Catholic hegemony in families, at least, where the sons would mostly stay Catholic, and they might make mistakes, but then they start their own families and they continue the generation of Catholics. What was the difference between that, what I just described, and then sort of, yes, the altar boy who serves the traditional Latin Mass, but has a secret double life? Where did that, come from? Because, I'm sure, as I used to be a kid not that long ago, and I know I kept things from my parents. I'm sorry, Ma, but I kept things, and but it was never that serious, and it was always my parents were very on top of things, and they always were aware when there was something mortally wrong or something seriously wrong in their children. But I just want to know, was there just a general like asleep at the wheel feeling that was going on with the parents?
Well, I have to say that a large part of the beginning of my book, goes into many of the conditions at that time that contributed to what you're just talking about. Mm-hmm. First of all, I mean, I'm not going to give them in any special order right now. I explain them in my book in order, but based on the narrative of the family. But first of all, World War II deeply affected our fathers, profoundly affected the society. World War II that's where social engineering began. So that was a big break. The social engineering itself, because of World War II and what came after World War II, it was very powerful. Television, the large families that were living in suburbia played a huge role. And if you want to get a better idea of that, read E. Michael Jones's The Slaughter of the Cities, where he talks about, and the suburbia came into being after World War II.
Right. Escape the cities.
Yeah, and the neighborhoods where the like I said in my book, the boomers were a tribe of peers. We were a tribe of peers, and Strauss and Howe say that.
Is that why youth crime skyrocketed during that time?
Yes.
Hooliganism.
And it's not like the first generation that ever happened to, because again, Strauss and Howe talk about, in the 1920s, which was the other generation of the sexual revolution. It was also followed World War I. But as technology gets more and more advanced, and there's more and more entertainment and more distractions, it gets worse. So, yeah, after World War II, parents lost track of their kids. I do go into quite a bit of detail in my book about that, based on even my own family, but also on research. And there were a lot of reasons why that happened. And, the entertainment industry was just that much more powerful. to draw kids away, and peer pressure, and the public schools, and yeah, it's just there were many things, but that's when the word generation gap was born.
Right.
And that's a big part of the book, is just why there was such a separation between the generations. And the thing about your generation is that there's a lot of remedial work that was done between the 60s and now.
Oh.
Like we didn't have chastity education. That came after people realized how bad things had gotten. The return to traditional bringing up of children, that came after a lot of the parents that are doing that realize what happened in their own lives, like I did. So there's been remedial work since then. But at that time, it was just breaking down. There was a lot of breaking down for many reasons.
Yes, and you brought up my generation, and I like to draw comparisons, Margaret, between, of course, the Zoomers and the Boomers, because there is quite a bit of there's a similarity in one thing, at least, is that my parents and your parents were raising children during inflection points in history, where you're on top of you can't see what's over the horizon, or you can't see what's over the mountain beyond the range. And I try to tell people that raise my cohort that you didn't know what the internet would bring. No one knew what the internet would bring about in society. Yes. And it's very similar to what the 60s propulsion of all of those different genres of music and substances and movies, all the arts, all the what I like to call the mechanisms of propaganda. No one really knew, and it makes me sad, because I'm very interested in how fathers make or break families, and you brought up how the fathers were, of course, deeply affected by World War II, which is understandable, but not a lot of people like to talk about World War II as being a war with PTSD. There's a mythos that says Vietnam is kind of the birthplace of the PTSD-ridden veteran, which is kind of a misnomer. And I feel sorry for the men in those generations. They must have been dealing with so much trauma and stress.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. And they I think they stuffed it, which means they stuffed a lot. A lot of emotional. They were definitely affected by World War II. And I do talk about that a bit in the book. And they were also the generation that was dealing with the first wave of feminism, because the GI women were the proto-feminists, and the GI men.
Please, because there's a myth about the 50s housewife I'm sure you're familiar with.
Well, it certainly wasn't in every household, but it was the beginning of women, like my mother and her sisters, going back to my story. They, as time went on, they were definitely for contraception and having fewer children and women going back to work. And there's another book that I researched called No Place Like Work, and it talked about how after World War II there was beginning to be mounting pressure on women to go back to work, to leave their household and their children and go back to work. And of course, during World War II, women had already begun to work because the men had all gone to the war. So there was already a feeling that women should, and this is what feminism really is. It's about women leaving the household and leaving the raising of their children to other people. That is the result of feminism. and daycares and, surrogate motherhood in the rearing of children. And
Mm-hmm.
that all started a little bit slowly after World War II and during the 50s. And my mother went back to work when I was 3, and it did affect the household.
Mm-hmm.
And they and there was started to be, a call that women should go to work. That was all starting to happen during that time. Again, there's so many deep roots to this that I can't go into all of it, but you know, there was definitely the beginning of the sense that the first feminists were, really becoming powerful during that generation, I would say, calling for women to go back to work and, when they were married and had children, and equal rights.
Yeah,
The,
and
the whole the whole feminist movement. It was beginning,
which
and the
is,
men
mm-hmm. Sorry.
and the men were often, the fathers were often not very involved in the rearing of the children and in the household. Again, that's documented in Strassenhau's book Generation, and in some other books. So
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that when you talk about, of course, you described feminism very well. A lot of people just know it as a sort of, pop culture phenomenon. We want the same right as men do to vote, right? And that's I remember they were talking about the rights of women at the time of the National Congress in uh,
yeah,
in France there in 1789 in the early 90s. Um, but then the people just think it's just about the right to vote, and then it's just that, it's just that. But then it goes beyond that. And you also mentioned too that the men weren't very influential or weren't very big into raising the children. To me, that from what I've studied, that goes back even several generations before the boomers, where the men would look upon their baby when it was born and then shake the hand of the child when he turns 18. That was kind of that's kind of the
yes,
stereotype. And
yes,
to me, I mean, that doesn't sound like it creates a healthy balance, especially in men. I mean, women too, but especially in men when you have a a transactional relationship with your father, you know.
yes, yes. Well, um, yeah, it's interesting. My daughter's reading a book that talks about how this actually, I mean, it probably goes far back further, but this book traces it back to the Industrial Revolution,
Mm-hmm.
when, men were, um, taken out of the house, to work. And there was women stayed at home and men left to go to work. And it was very different from the way it had been in the past, where they worked together on a farm or in a business or something like that. So yeah, there's, like I said, there's very deep roots to all of this. I mean, women, after World War II, their husbands were working long hours. You know, they were home alone with the children. They were in the suburbs, so they were kind of, again, the suburbs kind of separated people.
Mm-hmm.
It created feelings of alienation. There were a lot of factors involved, which I touch upon in the book. I can't go into any great detail, but
Right.
I can touch upon.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I'm always like I said with the fathers thing, it's when you belong to soldier culture, when you're off to war and you're fighting, at least at that time, you were expected to immediately assimilate right back into society,
yes,
which to me is sad because I know the draft, to do mass conscription, that's actually immoral. A lot of Catholics don't know that. It's pretty immoral to do that as a nation. And I think about
yes,
what that does to society. First of all, you're rending husbands and wives from each other, or prospective husbands and wives, and then you're immersing millions of men into a state in life where most men are not called to. At least beforehand, you had a sort of caste system of soldiers who, that was their life and they expected it.
Yeah.
But now you have soldiers exposed to the horrors of war. They're not called to even take a life, perhaps in self-defense, most of these men. And there you go. You start seeing the effects of that. And what does that do to, the women folk who then have, across the nation, homes where there's no men, there's no strong men.
Right.
And then they're called to be Rosie the Riveter.
Right, exactly. Well, that's what happened. They were called to work in industry. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about. That's why it's such a long book. There is a lot to talk about what happened, and if it were just purely research, it would have been a shorter book. If it had been purely a story, it would have been a shorter book. But I combined the two. So
well, that's why it's a powerhouse. It's
But, well, thank you. But before we finish this particular talk, I thought I'd just read a little bit more about the boomers and how they turned out, and then, like I said, it gives you kind of an overview of what's discussed in the book. Is that okay?
Absolutely, go for it.
Okay. So the boomers, I will just read the headings this time, so that we can finish up in good time here. So the boomers' upbringing made them susceptible to being recruited into cults and the occult. So that was another thing that happened during my generation. The boomers were spoiled children. The boomers are the perfect consumers. And again, I'm reading the headings, but after the headings, there's a short explanation of how that happened. And boomers tend to discount reality. Boy, are you seeing that at the national level?
Yes.
Boomers are comfortable with lies. Hey, how did that happen? Boomers are also comfortable with stealing. That's when shoplifting started. Boomers value appearance over reality. That's a big part of the book. That has to do with child rearing and neurosis and so on. Boomers are hypocrites. And I just wrote, this follows directly from being liars and valuing appearance over reality, but it's worth pointing out this trait on its own. Boomers' God is their belly. When did, all this absolute indulgence in food? And one of the other books I refer to is just Joe Keenan's, his very funny book called Balsamic Dreams, and it's about the boomers. And, he talks about their obsession with food. Boomers are closer to their peers than their parents. Okay, this was, again, the beginning of the generation gap and that separation that you talk about, which I think still exists in most families.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've we all have seen it. There's even Catholic families, pagan families, you name it.
Yeah. Yes. Boomers are particularly distant from their fathers, which goes into the father, the lack of the father's influence in their lives. Boomers were the revolutionary vanguard of the sexual revolution, which, that's commonplace knowledge, but it's worth pointing out. Boomers are emotionally immature, and that, again, I go into that quite a bit in talking about the child rearing. Boomers are narcissistic. Now, I did point out that Christopher Lasch, who wrote his famous book about the culture of narcissism, he was starting to write about my generation. That's when it started to talk, they started to talk about narcissism. And now there's just so many books about narcissism. Yeah. So again, how did that happen? How were we reared? Boomers grew up in a rootless society. That definitely affected us. Boomers' ability to love is stunted. Boomers, and then I end my final subcategory is boomers had good points. And it's worth reading. It's worth reading a little bit from that because I know how much my generation is hated by a
Yes.
lot of the younger generation. And I said, boomers get a bad rap from other generations, but it is worth remembering the very pertinent fact that they are not completely to blame for who, as a generation, they became and what role they played as a generation in the destruction of the values of Western civilization. In fact, many boomers have discovered that over the course of their lives, they were hoodwinked by the elite and have led the attempt to stop the destruction that they foolishly or unwittingly put into motion. Starting with trying to heal from their many emotional disorders, they worked remedially to straighten out their neurosis and try to make themselves better than what they were brought up to be. As noted earlier, it was during the boomers' generation that the recovery movement multiplied its meetings. They often used them to attempt to help themselves to grow up. They recognized their shallow Christianity and their ignorance of its traditions. They returned to some kind of church to try to deepen their faith and to recover what had been lost. Strauss and Hall said the boomers, quote, spawned the most active era of church formation of the 20th century, unquote. Yes, many boomers, as they aged, sold out the original idealism of their generation and became the opposite of what they strived to be when younger, but some also held on to that idealistic streak to work for the common good, and they have stayed in the fight, working in their own boomer way, on the left and on the right, to change the wrongs of modern world seen in such things as the consumer society, the military-industrial complex, environmental destruction, and the destruction of nutritional, healthful food, government-funded education, the wholesale abortion of children, totalitarian government develops, and many other kinds of injustice and/or corruption. Most importantly, many boomers tried to rear their children differently than they were reared, even succeeded in getting homeschooling to become widespread. In one way, these are all parts of the same battle, the battle to fight social engineering in all its forms, that powerful economic, philosophical, political, and hidden power. And this is a quote from Alcoholics Anonymous, cunning, baffling, and powerful, to borrow a phrase from Alcoholics Anonymous, that the boomers knew only too well in their own lives and now see working in the lives of their children and grandchildren. So I didn't want to leave on the, finish on the note that, the boomers were all terrible.
Right.
Because we aren't. And I talk about, in the book, I do talk about the way to fight the social engineering. I mean, that's part of the book too, because I had to learn how to fight it myself. So.
And may I say that's some of the best, the best writing, the best parts of the book, of course, are there, in the remedial stage, in the recovery stage, because I will say there's a lot of books written by boomers about boomers, but as you know, they celebrate the destruction. They're in a fugue state. I think these authors are in like a fugue state, and they can't see reality for what it was.
Yes.
That's what's so refreshing about this, is that there's none of the self-importance, but there's what you mentioned in the good aspects of the boomers. I see it in yourself. I see it in my parents. There's a lot of self-agency. At least there's not that much passivity. There's a lot of action involved in the character, and I think it's good you actually ended on that, because there's a lot of boomers that are now parents or grandparents, and they've certainly found themselves on the right side of things after decades.
Yes, and it was hard work to get there. I'll just read one. I'll read one final thing from the book that you brought up about how boomers think so highly of themselves. And this is actually from page 1, and this is part of the introduction, and it addresses what you just said. And I start out by saying, I'm just going to get a drink of water here.
You're good.
Baby boomers think very highly of themselves. Most of them anyway. They like to praise their age, their feats, and their social contributions. They agree that they were a law unto themselves, rebels, revolutionaries, and insurrectionists. And they are proud of it because they have trouble seeing themselves objectively. Very few of them consider that maybe all those things were wrong-headed and caused damage. But I, a baby boomer, had the uncommon, though not unheard of, experience of seeing things in my past in a drastically different light than I had for most of my life. I stepped back, became more objective, and found that I had been wrong about the age of the boomers. Many of the things we did were not great. We have no right to celebrate them. In fact, we should try to reverse them if we can. Baby boomers think they have been so clever in bringing on the revolutionary changes in the society. But they were not clever. They were manipulated. They actually were the generation that handed the society over to the social engineers, the, quote, invisible elite, unquote, who were the grand manipulators of the masses. And now, more than 50 years after it was delivered to the social engineers, society is almost completely in the engineers' control. And these engineers include many boomers. No, the boomers were not the great original thinkers that they think they are. The boomers were pawns of social engineers. They were useful idiots. And now they are the living apparatchiks of their deceased masters. This book comes from my experience of changing my mind. I am a baby boomer who no longer thinks the social revolution was great, and I have written a history to explain why. So yes, they do. There's a lot of them that still celebrate it. A lot, yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's it's sort of like the greatest thing that ever happened since, sliced bread.
Yeah, and look at our society.
Yes. It's in a horrible state, our society.
It's in a horrible state, yes.
We got
and
good
so's
folks.
the world.
Mm.
So's the world, because the boomers in America have a lot of influence on the world.
Are you telling me Peace Corps didn't solve everything?
No, Peace Corps did not. Peace Corps did not.
Man.
They were kicked out of many countries.
Well,
and Peace Corps is in my book, by the way.
Yeah.
Peace Corps there.
Yes.
That was part of my Forrest Gump
It's true, yes.
experience.
Your journey. Maybe that's why
Yes.
baby boomers love Forrest Gump, because it's he's the everyman of the boomers.
Yes. It's a good movie. Yeah. My daughter likes it, and she's not a boomer.
No.
Interesting look at history. An
Yes.
interesting look at history.
If you were interested, or enjoyed, or merely rose an eyebrow at the words that were spoken in this conversation, I do beckon you to go to the description page of this video, click the link where you can purchase the book. As I said in the introduction, there will be more to follow. This is merely just the beginning, just toe dipping into the subject. So much more to be said, and so much more to investigate. Yours truly, Modern Monarchist. And until next time, God bless. Goodbye.